Welcome, traveler. The fire is crackling gently, mostly because the logs are damp. Your straw mattress is only mildly infested, a sign of prosperity. And the village crier hasn't screamed in at least 12 minutes, a local record. It is, in every measurable way, the perfect time to talk about crime. Not modern crime. Not the sleek, neon-lit kind with ski masks and hacking montages. No. We're talking about medieval crime. Crime so tiny, so personal, so astonishingly stupid, they wouldn't raise an eyebrow today. But in the 1300s, you might lose a hand for them. Or worse, be forced to spend the night with the village minstrel. So, lay back, breathe slowly. Pull your flea-infested blanket a little closer. And imagine, just for a moment, that you, yes, you, have committed a heinous act. You stole a turnip. And not just any turnip. You stole the sad, lumpy one from old Amy's field. The one with the weird growth on the side that looks like a nose. The one the pigs wouldn't eat. The one that somehow already smells fermented. Yes, that turnip. You monster. The scene of the crime. You were hungry. Your oat gruel was watery. The goose had stopped laying eggs out of sheer protest. And Agnes, that old hawk-eyed widow with the suspiciously strong throwing arm, had a whole field of root vegetables, just sitting there, mocking you. It was a crime of opportunity, a crime of desperation, a crime of mild inconvenience. You crept into her field under the cover of dawn mist, past the scarecrow, who looked suspiciously like your cousin Gerald, and grabbed the first lump of dirt with a vaguely vegetable-like texture. Congratulations, you are now a criminal. It's time for you to meet the medieval justice system. Now, in the modern world, a stolen turnip might earn you a stern talking to, maybe a $5 fine, possibly a passive-aggressive neighborhood WhatsApp message. But in medieval times, you have triggered a judicial event. Forget what you know about law and order. There's no CSI Canterbury. No lawyers in tailored robes and wigs debating legal precedent. Instead, justice comes in the form of the Manor Court, a delightful institution where your fate is decided by a local lord with an attitude of chronic constipation, a suspiciously smug bailiff who loves to be bribed for anything and everything, including front seats in courts, meet and greet with the executioner, and so on. 12 of your least favorite neighbors, and a goose, for ambience. Court is held in the Lord's Hall, which doubles as a chicken storage facility and triples as a wedding venue when needed. The floors are sticky with ale. The lighting is mostly candle-based and unreliable. The judge is technically just the landowner, and his main qualification is owning a hat with a feather on it. You are summoned by the bailiff, whose job is to yell your name in the most theatrical way possible. He arrives at your door mid-morning, already tipsy, holding a crooked stick he insists is the symbol of law. You, he slurs, pointing dramatically at your chest, have been accused of vegetable larceny. In court, Agnes stands with her arms crossed, wearing her battle bonnet, the one with the little bones sewn into it for intimidation. She presents her case with all the grace of a scorned grandmother. He stole me turnip, she announces. The ugly one. I saw him. He had the guilty hunch. You attempt to defend yourself. I've never seen a turnip in my life, you declare, bold as brass. I thought it was a rock, a spiritual rock. The crowd murmurs. The priest coughs. The miller eats something noisily. Then comes the classic medieval legal defense. I was possessed, you say, suddenly inspired. Possession was a common excuse, by demons, fairies, or the ghost of last year's tax collector. Forget the idea of a fair trial. This is trial by vibes. There's no evidence, no fingerprints, no CCTV. Just an entire village pretending to be lawyers, judges, and psychic detectives. Your neighbor Marjorie claims she felt the aura of theft near your house. The baker insists he saw you with soil under your nails. And Henry? Henry claims you were laughing in a turnip thief-like way, whatever that means. Then comes your final hope, the compurgators. This is a real medieval word, and it means people who swear you're not lying. You must gather 12 people who will publicly swear they believe you. You spend the day begging, bribing, and guilt-tripping your cousin who owes you a chicken, the miller who enjoys dramatic moments, your own spouse who reluctantly agrees, muttering, "You owe me turnips for life." They all stand with you, hands raised, faces mostly serious. "Yea," they say, one by one, "he is not the turnip thief." Except for one, Henry. "I dunno," he shrugs. He has very guilty ankles. The Lord frowns, takes a bite of suspicious cheese, and announces, "This court finds you kinda guilty, but not entirely evil," which is about as good as it gets. Your punishment is decided. The stocks you'll sit in the village square with your arms and head in wooden clamps while people walk by and throw things, mostly stale bread. Cow poop, goat poop, more poop, rotten vegetables, sometimes children and their poop. A fine. Pay Agnes 1 silver penny and 3 eggs. Pigeon eggs count. Public penance. You must walk around the village wearing a large sign that reads, "I stole a turnip. I'm a rootless scoundrel." The priest helps paint it. Medieval humor was the best. It becomes a local hit. There's even a lute solo. Shaming song. The local minstrel writes an incredibly unflattering ballad about you and your crimes. Now, in the medieval world, crime wasn't just about law. It was about balance. A stolen turnip threw off the cosmic equilibrium. Because food wasn't just food. It was life, survival, pride. And the punishment wasn't just about justice. It was about putting on a show. It had touristic value. Like a fair or a rock concert. A mild humiliation event to bond the community. You were entertainment and cautionary tale and scapegoat. But maybe, just maybe, in the heart of your punishment, you'll find redemption. Medieval justice system held great importance to give what you deserve for your sins in this life. It's not just about justice. It's also about purifying your soul of your sins. Merely a public spiritual service. You'll return to Annis's field with a fresh seedling. You'll plant a new turnip. You'll name it forgiveness. And the goose will probably eat it anyway. But let's not get too sentimental. Because while you're out there, planting your symbolic vegetable of penance, someone else is already committing another petty crime. Perhaps Hob the baker has been accused of selling loaves with suspiciously pointy ends. Or Edith the alewife is brewing without a license again, despite last week's very stern lecture from the priest, the reeve, and a passing goose. You see, in medieval villages, crime wasn't a rare event. It was a daily activity. They were very stupid, like gossiping, or embroidery, or mild arson, because what should have called a crime was vague. Anything could be a crime under the right circumstances and witnesses. And most crimes weren't grand or glamorous. Here's a non-exhaustive list of actual medieval crimes, all punishable by law. Insulting someone's beard, interrupting church with a burp, allowing your sheep to fornicate too publicly, owning dice, dancing too enthusiastically on a holy day, hiding eels in your cloak, pretending to be Welsh if you weren't, wearing clothes that spark envy, singing bawdy ballads near a nunnery. Each one carried a risk of exile, fines, or being publicly called a rascal. But back to you. You've paid your debt. You've worn the shame sign. You've endured the ballad of the blighted turnip, which, for the record, has a surprisingly catchy chorus. And now you're free, or at least free-ish, because your reputation has taken a hit. You're now that guy who stole the worst turnip in the Shire, which makes you a very specific kind of villain. The village has a long memory. So does the goose. Let's talk about medieval witnesses for a moment. In a time without cameras, legal training, or objectivity, a witness was really just whoever talked the loudest and seemed least drunk at the time. Some common witness types included the repeater. Always begins testimony with, "I heard someone say," followed by a loosely connected rumor from 3 villages away. The omniscient grandmother claims to have seen it all from her window, despite being 94, blind in one eye, and facing the wrong direction. The overly enthusiastic child, who insists they saw everything but is mostly describing a dream they had about a heroic badger. The parish clerk knows every sin you've ever committed and brings a list. Also brings snacks. The drunken shepherd, incoherent but weirdly convincing, ends every sentence with, "And then the sheep nodded, so I knew." The thing is, none of this mattered too much, because guilt in a medieval matter court was less about proof and more about public performance. If the crowd believed you looked sorry enough, you might get away with it. If you cried convincingly and blamed demons, even better. If you made the priest chuckle, acquittal. But if you were boring, dry, unmemorable, well, you'd better start practicing your cabbage dodging. The justice system's main function, community theater, the entire legal process, from accusation to verdict, was really just medieval street theater. No legal textbooks, no transcripts, no due process. Just a lot of pointing, posturing, and pretending to be outraged. Punishments were crafted not to reform you, but to entertain others, and maybe slightly inconvenience you. That's why stocks were placed in the middle of town. That's why shame signs used alliteration. That's why the miller always brought snacks. In fact, there are recorded instances of people attending public punishments as dates. Courting couples would stroll hand in hand past the pillories and say things like, "Isn't that the guy who said pigs should vote?" "Yes, darling. Let's mock him together." Even the punishments themselves could become spectacles. When a man was caught forging bread tokens in one village, he was sentenced to sit naked on a barrel of stale flour whilst reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards, followed by a very slow apology to each of the village hens. That's not justice. That's a folk play. And who is presiding over all of this? Your local lord, a man who owns the land, collects your rent, and settles disputes while wearing too many rings. This lord may or may not be literate, sober, and interested. He listens to your case while sipping mead, petting his dog, or falcon, and occasionally muttering Latin words like justitia or oopsie. His decisions are swift and often based on vibe. You seem guilty, but your hat is amusing. 1 lash less. If the Lord is away, his steward might preside instead. This is usually a man named Walter, who takes his job very seriously and once fined his own mother for inappropriate cheese sales. Either way, the outcome of your case depends largely on your relationship to the feudal pyramid. Are you a favorite serf? A skilled artisan? A solid tither? Or are you Arnold? Because if you're Arnold, the jury's out. Permanently. Here's the thing. You're not going to jail. Because medieval jails were not designed for turnip thieves. They were small, dark, expensive to maintain, and mostly reserved for foreigners. Accused witches, people who annoyed the clergy, or criminals wealthy enough to pay rent while incarcerated. Yes, that was a thing. But instead, your sentence is mostly about public inconvenience. You won't be locked away. You'll just be very visible. And in a village of 67 people, including the pigs, visibility is a powerful punishment. You'll become a cautionary tale, a bad song, a weird nickname, a recurring joke at festivals. Oi, careful, or he'll nick your turnip. It lingers. But you survive. Because in medieval society, justice was harsh, but strangely forgiving. You paid your price. You were mocked, fined, mildly humiliated. And then you moved on. Everyone did. Because tomorrow, someone else would commit a different stupid crime. Someone would insult the Reeves mustache. Someone would overcook communion bread. Someone would flirt too suggestively at the sheep fair. And the wheel of rural nonsense would turn again. Justice, you see, is less Lady Justice and more Aunt Linda at Thanksgiving. Everyone remembers everything you did wrong since the plague, and now it's all coming out. Let's say you survive your trial. Maybe the court lets you off with a warning. Maybe you have to give Agnes a replacement turnip, or a goat, or a deeply awkward apology in front of the church. Maybe you just have to spend a night in the stocks, while local children draw mustaches on your face with coal. But you're alive. You are now, legally speaking, a free person with turnip-related trauma. What's important to understand is that medieval justice was less about fairness and more about keeping the peace. And the peace, in this case, was, don't steal, don't fight, don't make Agnes cry. It was community-based, unpredictable, and incredibly local. Justice was served, cold, in a wooden bowl, possibly with worms in it. And the next time someone needed judging, you might be the one banging the gavel. That's how justice worked, shared, social, and mildly ridiculous. And so, if you've enjoyed this gentle foray into medieval turnip justice, if your heart was warmed by public shaming and surprisingly enthusiastic geese, if you now look at root vegetables with a cautious respect, then please consider subscribing. Not because we'll throw you in the stocks if you don't. Not yet. But because we have more of delightful legal nonsense, and you deserve to fall asleep to a story about a peasant being fined for letting his cow look judgmental in front of the church on St. Garlic's Day. Like, subscribe, or offer a small goat in tribute. We'll accept any of the above. You've escaped the cold wind. The pigs have stopped screaming. The town crier has finally lost his voice, and your straw mattress is only lightly crawling. It's the perfect time to relax, take a deep breath, and talk about medieval crime. No, not the exciting kind with swords and duels and epic betrayals. No high drama here. Tonight, we begin with something small. Something very small. Because the highly dramatic noble life stood upon the shoulders of turnip thieves, beard insulters, gossipers, witches, and witch hunters. Which means the ordinary peasants. You steal a turnip. Yes, one turnip. You didn't even steal it well. You dropped it twice, tripped over your own foot, and it has a dent in it that looks like the Virgin Mary if you squint wrong. But it was theft nonetheless. And in the Middle Ages, stealing someone's turnip could get you fined, whipped, or worse, publicly humiliated while being pelted with vegetables. Ironically, mostly turnips. So what happens now? Let's say you did steal it. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the turnip walked into your bag all on its own. Who's to say? It's your word against Agnes, and Agnes hasn't liked you since you accidentally insulted her goat last Lent. And now you're standing before the local court, which is, to be clear, not a grand marble hall. It's a wooden bench behind the tavern, presided over by a man who has never read a law, but does own a feathered hat. There's a sheep sitting nearby, possibly judging you. The whole village is watching. And you are, officially, in trouble. Stealing bread. Letting your pig poop on someone's walkway. Brewing ale with too much water. Gossip. Yes, gossip. You could be fined for saying that Theodore's wife looked a bit suspicious. A man with a stick then tells you to come to court. And by court, again, I mean a slightly less muddy patch of grass with a nervous-looking clerk scribbling things no one will ever read. You didn't even say what she was suspicious of. Just suspicious. And boom, you're on trial. This is medieval justice. Welcome. The crimes of the time were as charming as they were ridiculous. But back to you. You and your criminal turnip. The accusation process is simple. Someone points at you and says, "He stole a turnip." That's it. That's the whole start of it. Now it's time for your defense. You have several options. None of them are great. First, you can deny everything. "I've never seen a turnip in my life," you might say, standing knee-deep in turnip soup. Second, you can blame someone else. "It was Donald. Donald looks like someone who steals root vegetables." This may work, especially if Donald owes someone money, or has a punchable face, or had a farm. Third, and most popular, cry. Just break down. Sob until your nose runs and the town reeve. It's uncomfortable. Bonus points if you mention your dead mother, who may or may not have been a saint. Ideally, you will dramatically collapse into a puddle, which, thankfully, is always nearby. If the Lord is in a good mood, or drunk, or particularly moved by your theatrics, he may let you off with a fine. Fines are payable in silver, chickens, firewood, or in one remarkable case, a poem. True story. A man once paid his debt to the court by writing a love ballad about the local judge's dog. The dog was, apparently, smelling of flowers and honor. More serious punishments include time in the stocks. Those wooden contraptions where your hands and head are locked in place so people can throw things at you while yelling "thief" in increasingly creative tones. Or you may receive public whipping, conducted by a man whose job title is Beadle, which is exactly as fun as it sounds. Beadles took pride in their rhythm. Some even hummed while they worked. If your crime is truly heinous, say, you stole 2 turnips, then you might be sent to jail. Medieval jails were not designed for rehabilitation. They were designed for mold. You shared a room with rats, straw, and possibly a guy who claimed to be Jesus. Meals were irregular. The toilet was theoretical, and the beds were made of hallucinations. But don't worry. For petty crimes like yours, the worst you're likely to face is shame. Public, noisy, aggressive shame. The medieval justice system wasn't just about punishment. It was a form of entertainment. The whole village came out to see who got punished, to throw cabbage, and to laugh when you slipped on your own tears. And the court wasn't blind justice. It was very much peeking through the fingers. Biases were strong. If your cousin once insulted the baker's nephew, the baker's nephew's uncle might be the one deciding your fate today. Fair? No. Predictable? Also no. But somehow, it worked. At least it kept the peace. Sort of. Unless it didn't. But at least people tried. And don't forget the clerks, the true heroes of medieval bureaucracy. They wrote everything down in Latin, even though no one else could read it. They would write long, looping sentences about how the accused, being of sound but slightly suspicious mind, did on the day of St. Mildred unlawfully acquire a tuber of notable girth from the field of Agnes, widow of Ted. And they'd spell turnip 6 different ways on the same page. Eventually, your case ends. Maybe you're fined. Maybe you're whipped. Maybe you have to bake Agnes an apology pie. You are now, officially, a criminal. A reformed criminal. A respected member of the town, who every so often gets a turnip anonymously left on your doorstep as a joke. So you return home. You sit by the fire. And you think, was it worth it? Of course not. It was a turnip. But it makes for a good story. A funny one. One you'll tell your grandchildren one day, after checking that Agnes isn't within hearing distance. Now, before we move on and let you drift into gentle medieval dreams, you can close your eyes or sit back and relax, because there are more stories waiting for you. Stories full of legal absurdities, angry bishops, drunk judges, flirty scribes, dramatic pigs, and at least one man who tried to bribe the court with a meat pie. It almost worked. You're no longer on trial. You're free. Unless you stole that goose. Tell me the truth. I won't tell anyone. I promise. You've survived another day without being fined, flogged, or falsely accused of hexing the baker's sourdough. That's worth celebrating. So settle in. The fire is flickering. Your feet are dry for once. There's a faint scent of cabbage and justice in the air. Tonight, we journey deeper into the medieval legal system, a realm where logic takes a gentle nap, and decisions are sometimes made by a man holding both a gavel and a goblet of wine. Yes, the court is now in session. Let's begin by answering an important question. What even was a court in the Middle Ages? The answer is, well, it depends. You had royal courts, manorial courts, church courts, borough courts, pea-powder courts. Yes, that's a real name. And occasionally, courts that were held in a barn because the local scribe was allergic to sunshine. Each court had its own style, its own customs, its own peculiar smells, and sometimes its own rooster. Let's walk through the most common types, starting with the one closest to the everyday peasant. The manor court. Justice served with a side of ale. If you were a peasant, and statistically you were, your crimes were likely handled in the manor court. These were presided over by the local lord, or his steward, or in one memorable case, the lord's dog, who technically didn't rule on anything, but did once pee on a defendant's leg, which was seen as a sign from above. The manor court was a charming combination of gossip, vague memory, agricultural tension, and mild threats. Held a few times a year, the court would gather the villagers, some accused, some witnesses, and some who just liked watching things happen that didn't involve turnips and cabbages. Everyone stood around while the court clerk read the charges in Latin, which no one understood, but everyone nodded solemnly to. Then the accused would step forward and defend themselves using one of three approved strategies. 1. I didn't do it. 2. It wasn't me. 3. Look, my goat is my witness. Verdicts were delivered swiftly, often with a shrug. Punishments ranged from symbolic fines to actual humiliation, and on one famous occasion, having to apologize to a pig. The pig was unmoved. The royal courts, where things get serious and slightly less coherent. If your crime was big enough, say, sheep rustling across parish lines, or punching a minor noble in the face, you might find yourself in the royal court. Royal courts were more formal. There were scrolls. There were scribes. There were men with actual swords and very real opinions. Judges here were educated. Technically, many had studied law. Some had studied wine. Most had studied how to look important while nodding thoughtfully and thinking about lunch. Sessions began with great solemnity. Someone banged something. Someone else unfurled a scroll the length of a fishing boat. Everyone tried to look like they weren't about to fall asleep. And then came the arguments. Now, you might think medieval legal argument was dry and scholarly. But no, it was dramatic. Think community theater with wigs. Defendants wept. Plaintiffs pointed fingers so hard they pulled muscles. One man, in an effort to prove his innocence, lifted his shirt to reveal a birthmark shaped like St. Cuthbert. Unfortunately, it was also shaped like a sausage, and he lost the case. Lawyers, if present, were deeply respected by themselves. They wore robes, carried important-looking books, and charged you based on how long they talked. Some were brilliant. Others were brilliant at lying. And a few were just there for the free ink. Then there were the church courts, run by priests, monks, and clerics who had taken vows of chastity, poverty, and smugness. These courts handled all things spiritual. Blasphemy? Church court. Clerical misconduct? Church court. Wearing a hat too flamboyant during Lent? You guessed it. These courts were surprisingly powerful. They could excommunicate you, a fate worse than death, because it meant you had to eat alone and couldn't be buried in the good part of the graveyard. The church didn't do executions, but they could hand you over to someone who would. It was like saying, we're not mad, just disappointed, and also, here's the man with the axe. One popular punishment: public penance. You had to walk barefoot through the town, carrying a candle and looking very sorry. Bonus shame points if it rained. Pea powder from the French pied poudreux, or dusty feet courts, were special. They were held at fairs and markets, where merchants, travelers, and general riffraff gathered to sell goods, drink, and accidentally insult each other's hats. Because disputes were common, your pig bit my wife. These courts were fast, very fast. You could be tried, judged, and punished before lunch. Some were held outdoors, under canvas, while judges sat on barrels. It was efficient. It was chaotic. It was absolutely full of yelling. Who are the judges? Great question. Sometimes it was a lord, sometimes a steward, sometimes a bishop. Occasionally, it was whoever had the most teeth and could write their name. Judges didn't always follow a consistent set of rules. They followed custom, instinct, and whether or not their breakfast had been satisfying. In some towns, a judge might be a stern and educated figure. In others, he was a drunk with a very large stick and the ability to pronounce wilt with flair. And yes, many were drunk. Not always. Just often. Especially on feast days, or market days, or Tuesdays. Let's not imagine glossy wooden benches and orderly proceedings. Let's imagine chickens in the corner, someone shouting about their lost cow, a judge sneezing into the evidence, a dog being called as a witness, someone fainting for attention, and a clerk desperately trying to keep up. Medieval courtrooms were messy, loud, and intensely personal. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone had an opinion. A trial wasn't just about justice. It was a social event. You went to the trial the way we go to movies, to laugh, to cry, to whisper, "Did you see what Agnes is wearing?" One man insisted his sheep was possessed and demanded the church exorcise it. The church agreed. The sheep bit the priest. The priest sued the sheep's owner for heresy. In another case, a man tried to defend himself by reciting the Lord's Prayer from sunrise to sunset, nonstop, to prove his innocence. It worked. He was let off and banned from speaking in court ever again. One clerk, caught forging a document, blamed it on the devil in my pen. The pen was thrown in the river. The clerk was fined a pig. And finally, in the most dramatic courtroom moment of 1347, two rival bakers argued so loudly about who invented the round bread, they were both sentenced to a week of silent prayer, together, in a closet. People were punished. Some were acquitted. Others were fined 5 chickens and went home confused, but lighter. Was it fair? Sometimes. Was it funny? Often. Was it terrifying? Always, especially if you had done something truly evil, like forget to bow to the bishop. Rest easy. Justice has been served, lukewarm, mildly confusing, and with a suspicious aftertaste of mead. You've made it through another sleepy stroll in medieval law. Your candle still flickers. Your feet are still warm. And miraculously, you've yet to be fined for existing. Now, we venture into a subject near and dear to the medieval heart: punishment. Not the terrifying kind with dungeons and iron maidens. Those are mostly myths anyway. No, tonight we look at the everyday kind. The ones villagers saw weekly, casually, perhaps even while nibbling bread. We're talking about public punishment. The kind that came with an audience, a few chuckles, and maybe someone throwing a fish. Let's begin. Let's say you were caught brewing illegal ale. Not bad ale, just ale that hadn't been approved by the ale taster. A man whose job was literally drinking for a living and deciding whether your drink was a crime. You've been tried, found guilty, and now it's time for your punishment. But first, we pause. Why? Because the beadle, the town official in charge of such things, is at lunch. In medieval towns, punishment was many things: a moral lesson, a community event, a chance to stretch your legs while someone else was tied to a post. But most of all, it was an event, and events needed timing, preferably after everyone had eaten and was in the mood to boo someone. So you, the criminal, wait patiently while the village finishes its stew. Then the bell rings. It's punishment time. Let's begin with the most iconic of punishments, the stocks. Wooden contraptions with holes for your ankles or wrists and head, placed right in the middle of town. Imagine a very unfriendly bench that invites public mockery. You are locked in, and people gather around. Some throw cabbages. Others throw old bread. A few throw philosophical questions like, "Why are you like this?" Children poke you with sticks. Your friends walk by and pretend not to know you. Your enemies walk by and pretend they do. Sometimes the sentence was an hour, sometimes a full day. Always long enough for your dignity to dry out in the sun like salted fish. But here's the secret no one tells you. You were expected to be funny. Yes, if you were clever, charming, or just knew how to make people laugh while your arms were trapped in a wooden frame, your punishment went down easier. One man famously spent his entire stock time pretending to be a goose. It was considered a community highlight. Now let's say your crime was a little more serious, like selling fake holy relics, or borrowing a neighbor's cow without asking. Enter the whipping post. The beadle, the local official whose resume included yelling, pointing, and light choreography, would tie you up and deliver lashes. How many? It depended on the law, on the judge, and on whether the beadle had recently stubbed his toe. This wasn't a private affair. This was done in the village square, usually on a market day, because nothing pairs better with carrots than moral superiority. Some whip recipients yelled, some cried, some sang songs. One woman recited a shopping list during her punishment. She was applauded for her organization. Fines were the most common punishment of all. Stole an apple? Fined. Fell asleep in church? Fined. Spoke ill of the Reeves' new haircut? Fined. Twice. But coins were rare for many, so you could pay in. Chickens, bread, firewood, labor. Or, in a few truly awkward cases, hugs and pigeon pies. The court would write down what you owed, often in illegible Latin. If you didn't pay, someone came to your home and stood in your doorway saying, "Pay up for 3 hours." This was known as enforcement. It was extremely effective. Medieval punishment wasn't just about pain. It was about reputation. Enter shaming. This included walking through town with a sign around your neck, wearing special clothes that screamed, "I am bad at pig keeping," holding a candle and looking guilty in church. The candle was mandatory. The guilt optional. Some towns even had shame masks, metal helmets shaped like donkeys, pigs, or your least favorite uncle. You wore them while standing silently, as everyone else enjoyed your misfortune. It was performance art, but legal, and it worked, kind of. No one wanted to be known as Bertha the Burper who blasphemed. Sometimes courts got creative. One man was sentenced to carry a dead fish through town because he lied about a miracle involving trout. Another had to sing in the marketplace about why it's wrong to steal onions. He was tone deaf. People still talk about it. In one village, a baker who cheated customers was forced to bake bread with extra ingredients and give it away for free while dressed as a loaf. Justice wasn't just law. It was theater. If you committed the same crime twice, things escalated. First time, fine. Second time, stocks. Third time, people stopped inviting you to feasts and whispered behind your back. The medieval world was built on community trust. Lose that, and you became that person. Every village had one. The guy who always borrowed things and never returned them. The woman who made suspicious stew which made her neighbors sick when offered. The man who once insulted a bishop and now lives next to the ditch. One small note. Medieval punishments were weather dependent. Rainy day? Stocks were wet. fewer people came to laugh. The cabbage didn't fly as well. Too hot? The whip handle got slippery. Too cold? Public shaming felt like a ski trip without the skiing. This led to many punishments being rescheduled. It was the closest thing to mercy most towns offered. Sometimes a judge or a priest would step in and say, "Enough. Maybe you had children. Maybe you cried. Maybe you offered the court a really nice cheese." Whatever the reason, mercy was granted, rarely, but beautifully. You'd go home with your fine reduced, your back unwhipped, and your dignity mostly intact. And you'd remember, today the cabbage missed. So what was medieval punishment? It was loud. It was local. It involved vegetables more than you'd expect. And somehow, it held society together. It reminded people that rules existed, and that if you broke them, you might have to wear a chicken mask and explain yourself in front of the baker's wife. Was it perfect? Of course not. Was it effective? Sometimes. Was it deeply, weirdly funny? Always. Dear listener, if you've laughed softly at the idea of someone apologizing to a pig, if you now fear cabbage in a new and meaningful way, if you've imagined yourself in a shame mask shaped like a loaf of rye, then you start to vibe medieval now, and enjoy the secure feeling of served justice. And wish luck for the beetle, who really wants to be famous. Walk proudly, steal no onions, and duck when you see a cabbage flying. Justice may be blind, but the villagers have good aim. So, you've broken a law. Perhaps you forget the prayer on a saint's day. Perhaps you shouted, "The bishop's eyebrows looks like an eye mustache," a bit too loudly. Perhaps your goat trespassed on monastic land and nibbled something sacred. But unlike your cousin Margarita, whose punishment involved holding a candle and looking embarrassed in church, you're going to jail. Welcome. It's colder than expected, darker than necessary, and it smells like wet socks and fear. You are now in a medieval jail. But don't worry. Everyone's miserable here. That's the point. Modern jails are places where people serve their punishment. In the Middle Ages, however, jail was not the punishment. It was a place to wait. Wait for trial. Wait for judgment. Wait for someone to pay your fine. Wait for someone to remember you exist. You might be in jail for a few days, or a few weeks, or long enough to develop a complex relationship with a passing rat. Jail was less a penal system and more a holding pen for legal confusion. Imagine a stone room with one small barred window that doesn't open, a door with a lock the size of a donkey's, a bucket in the corner as a toilet, straw on the floor, possibly alive. At least it's moving somehow. There are no beds. There are no blankets. There is no furniture, because you don't need anything else but the redemption from your sins. And the smell is what medieval people believed causes diseases. Everything is slightly damp, including your thoughts. The air never moves. The draft comes from nowhere and everywhere at once. It's like living in a medieval armpit with architectural ambitions. Jail wasn't a private affair. You were likely sharing the space with a thief who only steals spoons, a man accused of sorcery because he owns a cat, a woman who laughed during the Sunday service, a goat. Long story. No one knows each other's names. Everyone knows each other's crimes, and every single person blames someone else. Conversation is minimal, because talking makes your breath visible, and no one wants to be reminded of their own mouth fog. Occasionally, someone sings, usually poorly, often in Latin. The jailer is a man of great power and very little dental care. His job is to lock the door, occasionally feed you, collect fees and bribes, yell for no reason. He doesn't like his job, but he loves holding keys. He jingles them constantly. He's not entirely sure what they all open. Some might be decorative. You can bribe him for favors, or for your basic survival essentials. Warm water? That'll be a copper coin. A blanket? A chicken? A message to your wife? Depends how much he liked the chicken. The jailer is the unofficial king of the cell block, and he rules through mild threats and dried meat. How do you eat? You don't, really. Food is supposed to be brought by your friends or family. If they forget, or if you don't have any, you rely on what the jail provides, which is to say, gruel. Gruel is a mysterious substance, not quite soup, not quite porridge. It's warmish, grayish, and comes in a wooden bowl that looks like it's seen some things. Sometimes there's bread, but you can't dare to eat it having an entirely different ecosystem on it. Water is available, if you're willing to drink it. Most inmates aren't. Water was scary outside, let alone in jail? No thanks. Well, if you're a nobleman or merchant with connections, your jail experience is different. You might get your own cell, maybe even a mattress, possibly something to write with. Your meals are delivered. Your chamber pot is emptied. Someone might even bow at you once a week. It's still jail. But it's the kind of jail where you can sulk with dignity. For everyone else, dignity left 3 days ago and was last seen being eaten by a rat named Godfrey. People did try to escape. They dug with spoons. They bribed the jailer. One man disguised himself as a monk and simply walked out while chanting. He was caught because he forgot to change his shoes. Another tried to tunnel through the wall using a loaf of bread. It crumbled. So did his dreams. But most prisoners didn't try to escape. Not because they liked it, but because the outside world wasn't always much better. At least in jail, no one asked if you'd paid your tithes. If you were a cleric, you might end up in an ecclesiastical prison, a jail run by the church. These were quieter, cleaner. There were often prayers, a lot of them. Punishments here were spiritual. Lots of fasting, lots of candle holding, lots of chanting. One monk was sentenced to copy the entire book of Psalms, in silence, while sitting in a cold hallway. It took him 4 months and most of his will to live. But at least he had light, and soup that didn't hiss. You might wonder, what was jail for, really? Not to reform, not to educate, not even to punish. It was simply to hold you, to keep you still, to make sure you showed up to your trial, if you got one, to remind you that freedom was conditional and comfort was optional. Some towns even charged you for your time in jail. Yes, you had to pay rent for being imprisoned. It was like a very bad inn with invisible pillows. If you couldn't pay, you stayed indefinitely. One man was jailed for theft, served 2 months, couldn't afford his release fee, and stayed for 3 more years. He left with 2 teeth and a deep hatred. Medieval jail was awful, but it wasn't meant to be nice. It was meant to frighten, isolate, and bore you into submission. It wasn't about law and order. It was about pause and discomfort. You left that place changed. Worse, probably, but also quieter, hungrier, and very eager never to speak ill of a bishop again. Morning in the medieval village. Birds chirp. Cows grunt. The baker burns his 3rd loaf. And across the square, a man is building a scaffold. You hear the hammering before you know what it's for. But then you see the ropes, the crowd forming, the vendor setting up his pie cart a little too cheerfully. Ah, someone's getting executed today. You're not in trouble this time. You're just part of the audience. And you, like most people in town, have come to see the show. Because in the Middle Ages, execution wasn't just punishment. It was also entertainment, education, and occasionally a picnic. Let's take a nice, calming walk through the world of medieval public execution. Just don't forget your handkerchief and a bit of bread. Executions weren't everyday affairs, but they were regular. The crimes that could earn you a death sentence included murder, obviously, treason, especially if you said it in Latin, arson, especially if you lit something church-shaped, horse theft, yes, really, Counterfeiting, the medieval version of printing your own monopoly money. And depending on the location and year, you might also be executed for poaching the Lord's deer, cursing at a priest during Lent, being extremely annoying while being Protestant. Punishments were inconsistent. One man might be fined for theft, while another might lose his hands for spitting in the church garden. It all depended on the mood of the judge, the mood of the church, the weather, whether the executioner had other plans that day. Types of execution? Let's review your classic options. 1. Hanging. The most common method, simple and public-friendly. The condemned stood on a cart, a rope was tied, and the cart was pulled away. If done poorly, it took a while, but the crowd gets more pleased. If done well, it still wasn't great. 2. Beheading. Usually reserved for nobles. A sign of honor, because what's more dignified than someone removing your head in front of a crowd? Of course, not all executioners were skilled. One low-grade nobleman was struck 7 times before his head came off. The executioner apologized to the crowd for the delay between blows. He was an intern. Also, did you bring your handkerchief as I told you? Because you can dip it in the blood of the noble as a souvenir, as it was a custom at that time. Some remains even sold on the market afterwards. 3. Burning. Typically used for heresy and witchcraft. Fire was dramatic, symbolic, and quite literally overkill. The condemned was tied to a stake, surrounded by kindling, and prayed over, unless the priest was running late. 4. Drowning. Especially popular for unlicensed gossipers, grousing wives, and the occasional rebellious nuns. They'd tie a stone to your feet and have a brief theological chat about buoyancy. Or tie you to a giant seesaw to see how long it takes for a bad wife to drown. Yes, it's real. 5. Drawing and quartering. This was saved for traitors, and only the highest level. It involved dragging, hanging, disemboweling, and dividing you like a meat pie. No one wanted to eat. Grim, but thorough. 6. Crushing, impaling, or being buried alive. Rare, but not impossible. Usually done in remote areas, or when someone said, "We want this to be memorable." The executioner, part butcher, part therapist, part local celebrity. The executioner was a strange figure in medieval society. Feared, needed, paid in coin and ale. He often wore a hood, not for style, but because he was usually someone nobody liked seeing at the tavern later. Many executioners had learned on the job. Many inherited it from their own fathers. It's a family business. Few had training. Some had personal reasons and work in the fields with the other candidates when there is no execution scheduled. At least one became an executioner after being pardoned from his own death sentence. Imagine doing the job interview for that. Executioners were also tasked with torture, pre-trial or post-lunch, dismembering corpses, collecting heads, cleaning up. This part was often skipped. The job came with free lodging and frequent nightmares. Execution day was a social event. You got up early, dressed semi-nicely, and walked to the square with the kids. Vendors sold beer. The baker rolled out hot buns. Someone played a flute. It was a festival of death, but, cheerful. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Wives packed lunches. Old men grumbled about back in my day. Hangings were punctual. People took sides. Some booed. Some wept. Some placed small bets on how long it would take. One woman brought her knitting. The condemned, meanwhile, stood tied to a pole and tried to look meaningful. Final words, the most awkward speech you'll ever give. Before dying, many were allowed to speak. Some used the moment to apologize, proclaim innocence, shout at the bishop. It's the best time to let it all out. Some say how boring it was at the church, how ugly their wife is, how disgusting that mole is on the Lord's nose. It's dark and hairy. One man proposed to his girlfriend as his last words. She declined, citing logistical issues. The speech didn't affect the outcome, but it was tradition, and everyone loved a good monologue. The moment arrives. The crowd hushes. The executioner checks the ropes, the blade, the fire, or whatever other dramatic implement is being used. The priest says a prayer. The condemned mutters something, possibly involving his goat doing something unchristian to the judge. And then it happens. Quick, loud, unpleasant. Sometimes clean, sometimes not. If the executioner failed, the crowd would turn on him. One was chased out of town for taking too long and accidentally hitting the wrong person. He got better at it after that. What happens next? After the execution, the body was dealt with. How depended on the crime. Heads might be displayed on spikes. Bodies buried in unhallowed ground. Some were dumped in rivers. Others left for the birds and the Lord. The audience dispersed. People went home. Children asked difficult questions. Parents gave vague answers, like, "He was naughty," or "Don't steal horses," or "Don't look at the bishop in the eye for too long." And by evening, the square was quiet again, except for the scaffold, still standing, still creaking, waiting. Why was this normal? Because it worked. Not as a deterrent. People still committed crimes, but as a ritual, as a way to show people who has the power over their lives. And it's not themselves. Public execution reminded them that laws existed, that power was real, that you should probably not insult the sheriff in Latin, and keep your head down. It was symbolic, it was visceral, it was terrifying, and it was routine. You weren't supposed to like it, but you were definitely supposed to watch it. One man scheduled to be hanged was found praying so hard they postponed the execution. He kept praying. For 3 days, the jailer fell asleep. The rope snapped. He was let go. It was decided that God had opinions. Another criminal, on the way to the scaffold, escaped, ran through town, hid in a pigsty, was caught, brought back, escaped again, hid under a nun's cart, caught again, finally executed. The crowd clapped. It had been a very entertaining afternoon. One woman cursed the crowd so viciously before her beheading, the crowd asked the priest to bless them. He did, twice. And after all that, life went on. The scaffold was cleaned. The executioner went home. The crowd went back to gossiping about weather and bread prices. Justice had been done, publicly, loudly, and with pastry carts nearby. You'd talk about it for days, maybe weeks, maybe longer, if the condemned had said something particularly juicy. And then, slowly, the story became legend, then rumor, then a bedtime tale told to scare children into finishing their chores. Eat your soup, a mother might say, or you'll end up like that man who said the bishop had funny knees. And the child would eat. Because in the Middle Ages, fear and cabbage were powerful tools. Imagine this. You've been accused of a crime. A bad one. Something serious, like stealing from the church, speaking poorly of a saint, or, heaven forbid, failing to kneel at the right time during a holy procession. You insist you're innocent. The townsfolk aren't so sure. The priest squints at you like you just tracked mud across heaven's doormat. There's no evidence, no witnesses, just suspicion. What do? They don't ask for an alibi. Lawyers? No, they had something better. They hand you a hot iron and say, "Hold this. If you survive, God says you're innocent. Welcome to trial by ordeal." Because in medieval Europe, when facts were fuzzy and justice felt too complex, the best course of action was to let God sort it out. Why did ordeals exist? It's simple. And by simple, we mean absolutely bananas. In a world deeply entangled with religion, the belief was this: God knows who's guilty, He sees all. He hears all. He even knows what you said about Agnes last Wednesday. So, if someone is falsely accused and put through a painful, ridiculous test, God will intervene to protect them. The logic was, innocent, miraculously fine. Guilty? Well, you'll probably be on fire soon. This was known as the Judicium Dei, the judgment of God. A divine courtroom, with no jury, no lawyers, and a 100% chance of third-degree burns. Let's walk through the greatest hits of trial by ordeal. All very real, all very medieval. Ordeal by hot iron, perhaps the most famous. Here's how it works. You're given a glowing hot iron bar. You must carry it for several paces. Then your hand is wrapped in cloth. After 3 days, the priest unwraps it and checks your burn. If it's healing well, innocent, God has clearly blessed you. If it's infected, oozing, or smells like regret, guilty. Off to punishment. It's less of a trial and more of a medieval bake-off where your skin is the pie. Ordeal by boiling water, another classic. A cauldron is filled with boiling water. At the bottom, they place a stone or iron ring. Your task? Reach in. Grab it. Smile bravely. Again, your wound is wrapped and inspected 3 days later. Ordeal by cold water. This is what historians call completely bonkers, because it is very strange, even by medieval standards. The accused is tied up and thrown into water. The water is believed to be pure and holy. If you float, you're guilty. If you sink, you're innocent. Of course, this presents a logistical problem. Floating means crime. Sinking means innocence and possible drowning. Medieval justice, where survival itself is suspicious. One man sank, was declared innocent, and was then resuscitated by being gently beaten with holy sticks. He later became a monk. Ordeal by firewalking, a lesser-used version. You walk across hot plowshares, literal metal blades heated in a fire. You're barefoot. Same 3-day inspection policy. It's like a spa day if your spa was run by angry monks with no concept of skincare. Ordeal by the Eucharist. Now, this one's more subtle. The accused takes the Holy Communion, the body of Christ, and is watched carefully. The idea is that if they're guilty, something bad will happen. They'll choke, vomit, spontaneously combust. You know, the usual, if nothing happens. Innocent, if you sneeze during the ceremony. Guilty, you're done. Who decided to use an ordeal? Usually a priest, sometimes a local lord, occasionally a village committee of deeply suspicious grannies. Ordeals were especially common when there was no clear evidence, the community was divided, or someone just really wanted to see a boiling cauldron again. Church officials typically oversaw the ordeal and blessed the instruments. Yes, even the boiling water, to activate divine judgment. You have not truly lived until you've seen a monk bless a pot of soup-hot justice. Were people really declared innocent? Surprisingly, yes. Not often, but enough to keep hope alive. Sometimes, priests would quietly help the accused by cooling the iron slightly, using not quite boiling water, speeding up the burn healing process with mystery ointments with ingredients, wine, and guesswork, especially if they believed you were innocent, or if your family had donated recently to the church roof fund. One woman passed the ordeal by hot iron with no visible burns. The priest declared it a miracle. Others claimed she had holy hands and should be canonized. She declined. In the 9th century, a man accused of stealing a church bell was subjected to hot iron. He walked 3 paces, dropped the iron, and yelled, "Oh!" The crowd took this as a sign from God. He was declared guilty. Of being clumsy. A priest once used cold water on a woman accused of witchcraft. She floated, cursed him, then swam away. She was later found fishing in someone else's pond. Charges escalated. Another man survived both boiling water and firewalking. He was then accused of sorcery, because clearly only magic could explain it. The system, as always, was watertight. So, did people really believe in this? Yes, sincerely. Ordeals were terrifying, ridiculous, and often deadly, but people believed that God would intervene. It made sense to them. They didn't trust humans, but they trusted divine signs. Also remember, life was rough. Most people already dealt with infection, malnutrition, daily sermons, the plague. If they could survive that, what's a little hot iron between friends? When did this stop? Eventually, the church began to realize, wait, are we just burning people because we don't know what else to do? By the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III, ironic name, officially banned clergy from participating in ordeals. Without the church's blessing, the rituals lost power. Local courts began shifting to actual evidence, slowly, reluctantly, and with many nostalgic sighs about the good old days of dunking your neighbor in a pond to prove your innocence. Some places kept the tradition alive unofficially for centuries. But by the late medieval period, ordeals were more folklore than fact. The cauldron went cold. The irons gathered dust. And the holy stick of lightly encouraging resuscitation was put away for good. And yet, it lingers. Even now, we talk about trial by fire. The idea that hardship reveals truth. That suffering proves character. It's a strange legacy. Because in the medieval world, truth wasn't always found in facts. Sometimes it was found at the bottom of a boiling pot. And sometimes that truth was, don't steal from the church unless you're really good with hot metal. If medieval justice was a stage, then the lawyers and clerks were the background actors, the ones holding the props, mumbling in Latin, and occasionally tripping over their own robes. They weren't the loudest voices in court. They didn't swing swords or pass judgment or build scaffolds. But they were everywhere. And they wrote everything down. Even the parts no one understood. Especially those. Tonight, we meet the forgotten scribblers of the Middle Ages. The lawyers, the clerks, the notaries, the scholars, the ones who turned crime and punishment into scrolls and paperwork. You won't find them in dramatic paintings or epic poems. But without them, the Lord's court would be about as organized as a pig fight during a windstorm. So, who were these people? Let's start with clerks. A clerk was anyone who could read, write, and keep a straight face while pretending to know what's going on. Most were men, often trained in monastic schools or under other clerks, and always within 10 feet of some ink. They served in all kinds of roles, writing legal documents, recording court cases, copying laws, prayers, and complaints about turnips, filing everything in systems only they could understand. They were the human printers of the Middle Ages, except much slower, messy, and prone to personal flourishes like doodles in the margins or sarcastic Latin side notes. One clerk, in the margins of a 13th century court record, wrote simply, "This makes no sense. Lord, help us." We relate. What about lawyers? Ah, the medieval lawyer, a creature both respected and feared, sometimes by the same person. Not all regions had them. Not all courts allowed them. But where they did exist, they often played several roles at once: advocate, interpreter of the law, Latin enthusiast, professional arguer. Their job was to navigate a confusing mess of laws, secular, ecclesiastical, royal, customary, and make them sound even more confusing when spoken aloud. This was often done in Latin, or in legal French, or in whatever dialect best disguised what they were actually saying. A good lawyer could get your fine reduced. A great lawyer could convince the court that you'd been wrongly fined for something your cousin did 3 years ago. An excellent lawyer could do all this while dramatically quoting St. Augustine and looking mildly bored. Some were trained in universities, like Bologna, Paris, or Oxford. Others were trained the traditional way, by watching older lawyers and copying whatever they did, including the frown. One common tactic: talk so long that the judge needs a nap, thereby forgetting to punish anyone. The paperwork never ends. Medieval law produced a lot of writing. Charges were written down. Testimonies were recorded. Verdicts were filed. Punishments were documented. Someone always underlined something dramatically, and all of it had to be kept somewhere. Enter the Chancery, the medieval office for legal records. Think of it as a very large closet, full of scrolls, some mice, and one clerk who definitely knows where that thing is. Just give him a moment. The paperwork was important. If you were accused of theft, it might be written in 4 places: the town record, the manor court roll, the bishop's copy, and Edward's angry notebook. One man was accused of goat theft 3 times in 3 courts. Each version had a different spelling of goat. One called it goat. Another said got. The last just drew a picture. If you've never read medieval legal Latin, congratulations. You still know joy. Medieval legal documents were stuffed with repetition, the said accused being the same person as the said man. Who is this man? Yes, that one. Passive voice. It was known that it had been believed that a crime may have been committed possibly. Phrases that sounded like curses. Per curiam suum judicium tenendum et deliberandum, meaning the court will think about it. Some clerks just made things up. One famous scribe copied a full page from a fish recipe into a land dispute record. No one noticed for 40 years. Notaries were like the final boss of medieval clerical work. They had authority. They had training. They had seals. Their job was to make things official: wills, contracts, land transfers, marriage arrangements, the romantic stuff. Once a notary sealed it, it was law, even if it was slightly crooked and smelled like wax. They were often the only person in town who actually understood why something was legal, though they were famously unwilling to explain it without being offered something baked. Law schools were the medieval universities of, why does this sentence still go on? In places like Italy, England, and France, law became a subject of academic study. Students sat in cold rooms, read heavy books, and debated whether Roman law applied to modern pig disputes. Professors spoke in Latin. Students wrote in Latin. No one understood anything until lunch. But those who survived the curriculum could become legal scholars, advocates, or the kind of person who insists on correcting the grammar in contracts. Some students became canon lawyers, experts in church law, which involved deeply spiritual questions like, can you marry your third cousin's widow's niece? How long must you fast after stealing from a monk? Is it okay to name your pig after a bishop? Answers: probably not. One feast day, and absolutely not. Much of the law in small towns didn't come from books. It came from stories. He stole once before. She never pays her tithes. I saw him speaking to a cat during a full moon. Clerks and lawyers had to navigate these informal reputations, which were just as powerful as any official document. One scribe noted that a man was of suspicious brow. No one knew what that meant, but it was written in 4 cork rolls. He moved towns. The daily life of a clerk. Wake up. Shaking bottle. Sit on stool. Write names you can't pronounce. Record testimony that contradicts itself 4 times. Try not to spill soup on the parchment. Copy the same oath for the 5th time today. Get yelled at for forgetting the bishop's titles. Correct it. Get yelled at again. Go home. Dream about being rich. It was not a glamorous life, but it was steady. And if you wrote neatly enough, people thought you were wise. One clerk's handwriting was so good, they made him mayor. He fainted on the spot. Though often mocked or ignored, the lawyers and clerks of the Middle Ages preserved order. They kept records. They maintained continuity. They ensured that when Agnes sued her neighbor over a fence, Someone was there to write down every word, twice. They didn't wear armor. They didn't carry swords. But their tools, the quill, the seal, the scroll, shaped history. And occasionally, they wrote rude poems about each other in court ledgers. Let us descend, quietly, politely, and slightly inebriated, into the world of everyday crime. No kings involved, no wars, no grand heresies. Just small towns, angry bakers, and one man who insists that pig was wandering of its own free will. Because in the Middle Ages, crime wasn't just about sin. It was about neighbors. And nothing brought out the spirit of justice, quite like two villagers arguing about whose sheep chewed whose fence post. Tonight, we examine the truly relatable offenses, the petty, the domestic, the wildly dramatic, for no reason at all. This is the court of small crimes, and it is never boring. Let's begin where most medieval crimes began, the tavern. Taverns were not cozy pubs with dim lighting and acoustic lute sets. They were loud, hot, unventilated buildings where ale was cheaper than water and tempers fermented faster than the wine. In such an environment, one could commit several crimes by lunchtime. Public drunkenness, insulting a neighbor's hat, singing the wrong version of a saint's hymn, punching someone who took your stool, punching someone who looked at your stool, punching someone just to stay warm. Fights often started over nothing. One documented case records a brawl over whether lentils count as meat. It ended with a broken nose, 2 overturned tables, and a priest being pelted with onions. There were rules, of course. But in the heat of tavern justice, rules were like spoons in a soup made of fists. And theft was a big issue, but not of gold or jewels. Of pigs. Pigs were wealth. They were bacon on legs. They were mobile banks with hooves. If you lost one, it wasn't just dinner, it was a disaster, which led to the most common and most emotionally charged accusation in any village court. He stole my pig. The usual defense? That pig came to me voluntarily. Your pig looks exactly like my pig. Prove it. All pigs look smug. In some towns, pigs were branded or had bells tied to them. One clever thief simply untied the bell and claimed, "This pig doesn't jingle, so it must be mine." He was caught when the pig bit him. In court, twice, marital and household conflicts made up a significant portion of medieval court records. Crimes included: struck husband with wooden ladle during supper, threw cabbage at wife during sermon, yelled plague upon your chickens before bedtime. One wife was fined for calling her husband a snail-brained fence post. He wept in court. She paid the fine in silence. Another man was accused of sleeping in someone else's barn and blaming the rooster for his lateness to work. The court sentenced him to a public apology to the rooster. Most punishments involved public shaming, light fines, and deeply awkward church-based reconciliation ceremonies. Imagine 2 people standing in front of a congregation holding candles and mumbling, "Sorry," while everyone tries not to laugh. Land disputes were the lifeblood of rural litigation. If your ox wandered into your neighbor's rye field, it was a federal offense. If your fence moved overnight, which they often did, mysteriously, during storms or after too much ale, there would be court proceedings, witnesses, and a drawing in the dirt with a stick. One villager was taken to court for harvesting apples that technically leaned over his fence. He argued gravity. The judge ruled in favor of the rightful angle of ownership. Another man was caught moving boundary stones at night. He said they seemed uncomfortable where they were. He was fined, mocked, and required to give the stones a ceremonial apology. The medieval world had no earplugs. So when someone kept singing after dark, or let their cow move through mass, it was a problem. Crimes in this category included singing secular songs on holy days, shouting at the moon repeatedly, encouraging geese to honk aggressively at travelers. Noise wasn't just irritating, it was suspicious. Unusual behavior could be seen as unholy, or even a sign of witchcraft. One man was accused of being possessed because he hummed too often. The priest interviewed him. He said he was just happy. They fined him anyway, just to be sure. Words were powerful, and sometimes punishable. You could be fined or publicly shamed for saying. Someone's child was questionably shaped. A neighbor's ale tasted like pond water. The miller cheated, which, to be fair, he probably did. Gossip trials were long, dramatic, and involved many witnesses, all of whom had different versions of the same sentence. One court record reads, "She did say, and I quote, that his beard looked like a rat's nest that's been excommunicated. She was fined 2 eggs and had to say something nice about him at the next market." Animal crimes. Yes, these happened. Animals could be tried for crimes. Swine, dogs, goats, and once a rooster that allegedly laid an egg. If a pig killed a child, which did happen, it might be arrested, held in jail, and formally executed. It was less about justice and more about symbolism, order, and possibly giving everyone something to do on a rainy Tuesday. One donkey was put on trial for malicious braying. It was acquitted when the priest said it sounded devout. How were these crimes punished? Small fines, payable in coins, eggs, or favors. Public apologies. Standing in church with a candle looking guilty. Sitting in the stocks while children laughed and asked uncomfortable questions. Sometimes, repeat offenders were given nicknames like Simon the Shouter or Goose Margaret. These stuck forever. One man committed so many small crimes, he was simply known as that guy. Everyone knew who it meant. Village justice wasn't about law. It was about balance. In a small town, everyone knew everyone. Every dispute was personal. Justice wasn't about strict codes. It was about making things right, restoring peace, letting Agnes save face without someone being burned. And sometimes it was about putting a pig on trial just to keep the children entertained. You wake up. It's a quiet morning. Your bread rose properly. Your goat is not behaving weirdly. You only whispered once about the miller's hygiene, and yet you have a strange feeling. Later that day, someone's crops fail. Someone's baby won't stop crying. A chicken walks in a circle. And before you can say, it was probably just a coincidence, someone points at you and says, "Witch, welcome to the medieval world of being a woman," where daily life was hard, dangerous, and occasionally interrupted by trials involving floating, burning, or being accused of dancing with Satan because your herb garden looked too green. Let's talk about women in crime in the Middle Ages. And let's begin, as always, with a long sigh. Women in medieval law. Technically human, but with asterisks. In medieval Europe, women were subject to the law, but rarely protected by it. Most laws were written by men, interpreted by men, enforced by men. Women could be fined, be arrested, be executed, but they couldn't vote, hold public office, testify against men in certain courts, escape the suspicion of knowing things they shouldn't. In short, if a man got drunk and yelled at a goat, it was Wednesday. If a woman did it, she was communing with dark forces. Common crimes committed by women. Let's review the greatest hits of female criminality. 1. Gossiping. Yes, this was a real crime, especially if it involved accusing a neighbor of theft, implying a priest was flirting, suggesting someone's child looked like the baker. Punishment? Public shaming. Or worse, the scold's bridle, a metal mask placed on the face with a little tongue piece to suppress talking. It was not flattering. 2. Midwifery without supervision. If you helped a woman give birth and things went wrong, you were a bad midwife, a criminal, possibly a witch. Never mind that the woman giving birth was 42 and lived on moldy cheese. Someone had to be blamed. 3. selling herbs without church permission. If you sold anything that claimed to cure coughs, help digestion, make your husband less annoying, you were walking a fine line between helpful and diabolical. If your tea worked, people got suspicious. She knows too much about plants, they'd say, while drinking wine fermented in a barrel last cleaned during the Crusades. 4. Being too loud, too quiet, too confident, too educated, too good at math. This was not written into law, but it was always understood. One woman corrected a priest's Latin during a sermon. She was fined, publicly rebuked, and mysteriously moved out of town. She became a legend among herbalists. The witchcraft problem was a big thing. Let's be clear. Belief in witchcraft was deep, widespread, and terrifyingly inconsistent. A woman could be accused of witchcraft for being left-handed, having a birthmark, knowing the weather before it happened, owning a black cat, owning 2 cats, making bread rise too perfectly. The logic was, something bad happened. No one could explain it. Teresa has that weird mole on her shoulder. Therefore, witch, the first recorded witch trial in Europe, took place in 1324. The accused? A wealthy woman named Alice Keitler. She was accused of sorcery, making potions, having a demon boyfriend named Robin. Honestly, if you're going to be accused of witchcraft, you might as well have a demon boyfriend named Robin. Points for flair. The trial, which involves a lot of screaming and not much evidence. Witch trials were chaotic and deeply theatrical. There were no reliable methods of determining guilt. So they used public confessions, usually after questioning with hot pokers. Spectral evidence, she turned into a goat in my dream. Swimming tests, sink means innocent, float means you're toast. Witch marks were moles, warts, or freckles, so basically skin. One woman was convicted because her butter spoiled 3 times in 1 week. Her defense, "It's been very humid," was not accepted. Another was accused of bewitching a man's cows. The cows were fine. The man had just had a bad day. Torture was often used to encourage truth. Women confessed to flying through the air, attending secret evil goat parties at nights, marrying demons, turning milk sour by blinking at it. One woman admitted she had bewitched the bishop's hat to never sit straight, a clear sign of the devil's influence. Or poor millinery. Most confessions were later retracted, but it was too late. Once someone was declared a witch, the odds of surviving trial were lower than a chicken on roast day. Punishments were not exactly subtle. Convicted witches were hanged, burned at the stake, banished, or subjected to long public penance rituals involving pointed hats and chants, and exorcisms. Many, many exorcisms. In some towns, minor witches were just made to wear symbolic clothing and walk in circles until everyone felt morally superior again. It's worth noting that not all towns burned witches. Many church officials preferred prison, penance, or mild flogging, especially if the accused offered meat or knew a good poultice for back pain. Still, the danger lingered, especially during hard years. Crop failure, disease, war, someone had to take the blame, and it was rarely a bishop. Not just peasants, even noblewomen were suspect. If you were rich, well-read, or politically active, congratulations. You had more to lose. Several noblewomen were accused of witchcraft simply because they read books, didn't want to marry, knew how numbers worked. Joan of Arc, famously, was tried and executed, partly under accusations of heresy and sorcery, for wearing armor, leading troops, and hearing voices. All things men did regularly, with significantly fewer consequences. Sometimes women fought back. Some women defended themselves eloquently in court. Some escaped. Some were protected by allies, priests, or entire towns. One woman accused of witchcraft responded, If I had the devil's power, you'd all be frogs by now. The court paused, then laughed, then let her go. Humor, the ultimate defense. Others quietly practiced medicine, healing, and midwifery despite the risks. Some even gained respect, though always precariously. It was a dance, a negotiation, a game of how much wisdom is too much before they start whispering. So, was any of this fair? Of course not. It was inconsistent, deeply gendered, and entirely based on fear, rumor, and scapegoating. And yet, this system persisted, because blaming someone is easier than fixing a problem. And a woman with too many herbs, too much knowledge, or too much personality was simply convenient. There's a fire crackling nearby. You've survived accusations, trials, boiling water, pig disputes, cabbage-based public punishments, and at least one legal document that may or may not have cursed your descendants. Now we pause, and we ask, with the gentlest shrug the 14th century can offer, what did medieval justice actually mean? Was it fair? Was it wise? Or was it just a very elaborate way of keeping people from hitting each other with bread loaves? Let's take a walk, not through the courtrooms, or the gallows, or the goose-haunted taverns, but through the ideas behind it all. Let's talk about justice, or at least medieval attempts at it. What was justice meant to be? In theory, it was order. A way to keep the peace, a way to protect the weak, a way to remind everyone that while the world may be full of mud and plague, someone was writing things down. Justice wasn't about freedom or fairness. Not really. It was about balance. And more than that, it was about belonging. You were part of a village, a manor, a parish, a kingdom. If someone stole your sheep or insulted your fence or seduced your cousin with unauthorized rhymes, it wasn't just an insult to you. It was a disruption to the whole community. And justice? Justice was how things got patched back together, even if poorly, even if with splinters, even if the person doing the patching was holding a jug of ale and a grudge from 1328. Why so much public humiliation? Because it worked. Stocks, pillories, shame parades, punishments involving vegetables. Why? Because they reminded everyone what not to do, loudly, visibly, and with dramatic flair. In a world where most people couldn't read, where news spread by rumor, and where crime and punishment happened in front of your neighbors, shame was the real sword of justice. It was sticky. People remembered it. More than one court record ends with the phrase, and he was never quite looked at the same way again. And what of mercy? It existed, surprisingly often. Some judges forgave. Some priests intervened. Some lords said, "He's an idiot, not a criminal. Let him go." Some women avoided execution by cleverness, kindness, or sheer social exhaustion. One man, convicted of throwing soup at a monk, was sentenced to a public apology, but when he began to cry halfway through, the monk hugged him. The court collectively decided to call it a draw. Medieval justice wasn't cold. It was personal, which meant it was flawed, but sometimes beautifully human. What about the people who wrote it all down? The scribes, the clerks, the notaries, they preserved it all. Every insult, every accusation, every goat-related injury. Thanks to them, we know how people settled arguments, what people feared, how many different ways there were to spell the word turnip. Justice left a paper trail, or a parchment trail that told us not just what people did, but how they lived, what they cared about, what made them angry, what made them laugh. One clerk doodled a pig in the margin of a witch trial, possibly out of boredom, possibly because the pig was involved, possibly because justice, too, needs a mascot. The system wasn't perfect, and that's putting it mildly. There were bad judgments, unjust executions, confessions pulled from pain, lies carved into law, lives ruined over rumors. But there were also community rituals that healed rifts, towns that protected their own, elders who remembered past kindnesses and made space for second chances. In the worst of it, there were still moments of strange, quiet compassion. A farmer who gave bread to his accuser. A jury that forgave a boy for stealing eggs after seeing his shoes. A jailer who left the door unlocked by accident and claimed divine intervention. So, was it justice? Sometimes, and sometimes not. Sometimes it was fear disguised as order. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was entertainment with robes on. But always, it was human, messy, funny, petty, wool-covered and cabbage-scented, and filled with arguments that began with, "She said my pig was ugly." And yet, it held communities together, with spit and parchment, and the occasional duck-related lawsuit. In the end, justice in the medieval world wasn't a system. It was a story, told in town squares, whispered in taverns, etched into wood and ink and bread crusts. It was a story that said, "We see what you did, and we're going to talk about it for the next 7 decades." It said, "Yes, you stole a turnip, but you also helped rebuild the fence, so we'll call it even." It said, "Don't throw soup at monks, even if they do sing off key." And occasionally it said, "You're forgiven." Let's take a moment. Step away from the peasant trials, the cabbage-throwing punishments, the pig disputes, the boiling water, and the unfortunate turnip misunderstandings. Let's go up the hill, past the fields, past the town, past the pond with the passive-aggressive goose, up to the castle. Because while medieval justice was busy dunking gossipy villagers into ponds and sentencing bakers to public apologies, the nobility had their own system. A system where laws were more like suggestions, where judges were often family, where punishments were sometimes optional, or at the very least, postponable until the next feast day. This, my friends, is the world of lords and ladies. A place of fine wine, long robes, shiny rings, and the subtle but constant sound of someone getting away with something. Let's enter the halls of power, quietly, respectfully, and preferably with a gift in hand. Because noble justice is a different flavor. Let's begin. The first thing you need to understand is that lords and ladies weren't just rich. They were landowners, military commanders, feudal overlords, and in many cases, literal judges. Yes, they judged others, and occasionally themselves. If a peasant stole an egg, he might end up in the stocks. If a baron burned down a rival's barn, he might write a very long letter to the king, explaining that it was all a misunderstanding involving a dramatic misfortune. The noble class had access to what scholars call elite legal immunity, and what everyone else just called noble nonsense. Let's break it down. Lords were often granted rights of jurisdiction over their own lands. This meant they could hold court, issue fines, decide disputes, collect taxes, and look mildly interested while someone explained their fence had been moved by the wind again. These manor courts served both to keep order and to remind everyone who was in charge. But when the lord himself committed a crime, well, then things got interesting. Let's say a lord assaults a priest. This happened more than you think. Maybe the priest called his hat excessive. Maybe the lord had been drinking. Maybe it was a misunderstanding involving the tax prices. Whatever the reason, there is now an injured cleric and a very red-faced baron. The local court, which reports to the baron, investigates. Guess what they find? That the priest may have, quote, looked at the baron in a way that suggested theological disrespect. Case closed. The priest is fined for improper face usage. The baron pays himself a small fine and donates a modest silver spoon to the abbey. Everyone claps. Justice is served. Nobly. Let's try another. A noblewoman is accused of ordering her servants to raid a neighboring manor's orchard. Pears were taken. Serious business. The rival manor sends a formal complaint. She responds with a poem. The poem is long, vaguely threatening, and references ancient Greek mythology. The case is dismissed due to lack of clarity and overuse of metaphor. The orchard is never mentioned again. Now, this isn't to say that nobles were never punished. They were, sometimes, if the crime was particularly scandalous or politically inconvenient. Even high-born individuals could find themselves in trouble. But the kind of trouble was different. Consider a nobleman who commits murder. Let's say he stabs another noble at a feast after arguing over who gets the last eel. There are witnesses. Blood, screaming. The killer is arrested. But instead of being thrown in a dungeon, he is placed under house arrest, which means he has to stay in his second castle. Not the nice one, mind you. The damp one near the marshes. He is told to fast, pray, and reflect. After 2 months of reflection, which involves hunting, falconry, and one regrettable lute concert, he is declared penitent and released. The victim's family receives an apology letter and a pig. Case closed. This system worked if you were noble. If you weren't, your best chance of justice was knowing someone who knew someone who could appeal to the king. Writing a very good complaint letter, ideally in rhyming couplets. Or hoping that your lord had a soft spot for dramatic weeping. Let's take a moment to meet some real noble criminals. There was the Earl of Pembroke, who attacked a bishop with a fork during a dinner because the bishop had better shoes. He was fined. The bishop was gifted a new hat. They dined together the following week. Lady Isabella of Normandy once excommunicated herself accidentally by placing a cursed walnut in a cathedral. It's unclear why. She claimed she was bored. The walnut was buried in consecrated ground. The lady was given a stern talking to and an extra cushion during Mass. One baron in France refused to pay taxes, saying, "God has already made me noble. Why should I pay again?" He was sued and he countersued. The case went on for 11 years. By the end, no one remembered what it was about. Now, to be fair, there were some limits. If a noble committed treason or challenged the king or tried to poison an archbishop with tainted cheese, then all bets were off. At that point, even the nicest parchment wouldn't save you. Execution was rare for nobles, but it did happen. Especially if you lost a war, married badly, or refused to lend the king your best horse. But more often, punishment came in the form of fines, enormous, symbolic, and immediately negotiated. Land confiscation, temporarily pending the outcome of a 3-decade legal debate, or being sent on a pilgrimage, which was just a noble word for long holiday with spiritual paperwork. Pilgrimages were perfect punishments. You left town. You said some prayers. You came back sunburnt and slightly wiser. And best of all, no one got to throw cabbage at you. Now, let's not forget the role of ladies in noble legal drama. Noble women had limited legal power, but enormous social influence. They managed estates, oversaw servants, and when their husbands were away, sometimes acted as judges in manor courts. Lady Marjorie of Kent was known to rule with firm justice. She once fined a man for looking overly smug while eating pie. Lady Eleanora of York refused to prosecute a chicken theft because, quote, "I never liked that rooster anyway." One noblewoman famously negotiated her husband's pardon by sending the king a tapestry that told a very flattering version of events. It worked. Art is powerful. Now let's visit the royal court. If you were a noble accused of a serious crime, you could appeal directly to the king or queen. Royal justice was chaotic. Some monarchs were deeply legal-minded. Others made rulings based on astrology, the mood of their favorite dog, or how recently they'd eaten. King Henry II was obsessed with law. He once summoned a baron to court for cutting down royal trees. The baron claimed the trees were leaning provocatively. Henry fined him 3 oxen and wrote a poem about it. Queen Isabella of France once pardoned a nobleman because his apology letter was surprisingly poetic and included a drawing of a smiling donkey. Royal favor could change everything. One wink, one gift, one unusually enthusiastic falcon, and the charges disappeared. This led to a flourishing black market in influence brokering, where you paid people to mention your name near someone important. Imagine being cleared of murder because your cousin's cousin once fixed the royal harp. Now that's networking. But nobles weren't completely ungoverned. They still had enemies, and rumors, and clerics with long memories. A scandal could spread fast. A badly timed feast, a suspicious fire, a servant who talked too much. One nobleman was exiled because he accidentally insulted 3 bishops in a single toast. That takes skill. Another was forced to build a chapel as penance after his hunting party trampled a saint's shrine. He named the chapel after his horse. The church was not amused. And yet, despite the loopholes, despite the bribery, despite the comically flexible definitions of guilt, even nobles feared the law in one specific form: the angry mob. If the people turned against you, if your peasants refused to harvest, if your tenants cursed your name, if your dinner guests stopped laughing at your jokes, you were in trouble. Because even the grandest lord cannot rule alone. At some point, he must eat, and someone else is baking the bread. So while lords and ladies often danced around the law, they did so with a nervous glance at the kitchen, just in case. In the end, noble justice was less a system and more a performance. Everyone knew the rules were different. Everyone pretended otherwise. And somewhere in the background, a clerk wrote it all down, shaking his head and underlining the phrase, "This one again." So if you ever find yourself transported to medieval times, and someone asks if you're noble, say yes. Then quickly learn how to write a flattering letter, quote St. Augustine, and apologize while holding a very large goose. It won't make you innocent, but it might make you amusing. And in the medieval world, that was often enough. Please step gently. Dust off your shoes. Bow to the altar. Don't trip over the incense stand. And for the love of St. Mildred, do not mention anything political before the 5th bell has rung. Because tonight, we're stepping into one of the strangest corners of medieval justice. Not the king's court, not the manor court, not even the court of public opinion, where most judgments are made by old women with strong opinions and sharper elbows. Now we visit the church court, a place where sins are crimes, crimes are sins, and "I didn't mean to do that" is answered with, "Yes, but did your soul?" The ecclesiastical courts were deeply spiritual, deeply complicated, and let's be honest, deeply nosy. Let's light a candle, sit in the wooden pew that creaks too loudly, and examine the world of confessions, penance, and spiritual court drama. Welcome to the heavenly side of medieval justice, where judgment is eternal, but punishments are surprisingly creative. Let's begin. First, what was the church court? The ecclesiastical court was the judicial arm of the medieval church. It handled cases involving clergy members, church property, marriage disputes, moral behavior, heresy, sorcery sometimes, and most importantly, people who annoyed the bishop. It wasn't meant to replace royal or manorial law. It just ran alongside it, like a slightly judgmental twin. The church had its own procedures, its own courts, its own officials, its own obsession with candles. And if you thought regular medieval law was confusing, oh, dear friend, we are just getting started. Let's start with the types of crimes that got you dragged before a priest with a scroll. Category 1. Moral crimes. This included fornication, whether successful or attempted, adultery, gossip, drunkenness, if it led to singing, missing Mass, eating too much during Lent, and that most medieval of crimes, dancing suspiciously near a shrine. Punishments for these offenses ranged from public confession, wearing a white robe for a week, fasting, which no one followed properly, holding a candle during service and looking ashamed, or, in severe cases, being told not to attend feasts for a fortnight. Truly, a fate worse than hunger. Category 2. Marriage drama. Medieval marriage wasn't just a personal matter. It was a holy sacrament, which meant if you married wrong or too often, the church got involved. The court would investigate. Secret marriages, broken betrothals, consanguinity, that is, marrying someone you're related to, which in medieval villages was often everyone. Claims of impotence, yes, those were real trials. One court famously asked a man to prove his virility by performing in front of witnesses. He declined. His wife fainted dramatically. The judge cleared his throat and moved on. Category 3. Clergy behavior. If a priest misbehaved, and they sometimes did, the church took it very seriously. Misdeeds included drinking too much sacramental wine, starting fights at weddings, gossiping in Latin, secretly marrying, collecting donations with a sword. Punishment could involve suspension, reassignment to a miserable parish in a swamp, or being made to copy the Psalms until they understood humility. There was one monk who tried to bribe his abbot with a pie. He was sent to reflect on his sins in a damp cell and forbidden to touch pastry for a year. Harsh. Category 4. Heresy and sorcery. These were the big ones. Whisper the wrong theology, own too many herbs, or question why the bishop's hat was so pointy, and you might be accused of heresy. Trials for heresy were lengthy, terrifying, and usually conducted in special church courts, often with inquisitors who had memorized entire libraries of doctrine and no sense of humor whatsoever. If convicted, you faced excommunication, or worse, being handed over to the secular authorities for execution. The church didn't do the burning itself. That would be unholy. They just pointed at it. Now, how did church courts function? They looked like normal courts, sort of. There was a judge, usually a bishop or archdeacon. There was a clerk, usually stressed. There were scrolls, candles, and the faint smell of holy oil and frustration. But unlike secular courts, where you needed witnesses, church courts loved confessions. Not just, yes, I did it. They wanted spiritual, poetic, Latin-filled expressions of guilt. I, Gerald, son of Gerald, do humbly confess that I did gaze with impure thoughts upon the baker's niece, and felt the stirrings of carnal longing. That sort of thing. The more dramatic, the better. Some defendants added tears. Others sang psalms. One man recited an entire prayer from memory and fainted for effect. He was found guilty of both lust and theatrical heresy. Now, not everyone who came before the church court was guilty. Some were accused out of jealousy. Some were the victims of rumors. And some just happened to own a cat and live near a thunderstorm. One woman was accused of witchcraft because she sneezed 3 times and her neighbor's bread didn't rise. The court deliberated for 2 hours, then declared that she was probably not a witch, and the neighbor was probably not a good baker. She was told to pray and avoid sneezing near flour. Now let's talk about penance. If you were found guilty, the church didn't usually fine you. They gave you tasks. Think of them as medieval spiritual homework. Typical penances included saying a certain number of prayers every day, fasting on Wednesdays, Fridays, and days that smelled like fish, pilgrimage to a shrine, often far, muddy, and featuring disappointing food, wearing plain clothes and sitting in the front of church looking very, very sorry. One man was sentenced to write a hymn in praise of his wife after being caught admiring the widow near the mill. He tried. It rhymed poorly. He was made to rewrite it 7 times. Women, too, were punished, often more harshly. One was sentenced to carry a candle the size of her arm through the entire village, while people shouted, "Modesty!" at her. She dropped the candle. Twice, the priest sighed. Now let's discuss church court drama. Because yes, it existed. Clerics argued. Monks protested. Accused sinners shouted things like, "I was only pretending to be drunk for theological reasons." One abbot sued another for borrowing a relic without asking. One priest accused his rival of stealing his sermon. The bishop presiding declared both men guilty of vanity and sentenced them to a joint pilgrimage, during which they were not allowed to speak. They returned 20 days later, still not speaking. The town rejoiced. Church courts also handled wills. If you left your estate to whoever the Lord deems worthy, the church would spend months deciding who that was. Spoiler, it was usually the church. One man left his land to his dog. The court overruled him. The dog barked through the entire hearing. The record notes, a disturbance caused by a loyal creature. There was also the issue of excommunication, being cast out of the church. This was serious. You couldn't receive sacraments, couldn't be buried in holy ground, couldn't attend feasts. It was the medieval equivalent of being ghosted by heaven. People wept and begged. One nobleman donated an entire orchard to get back into the church's good graces. The bishop accepted, then suggested he donate a goat as well. He did. The goat was named after a saint. It escaped within a week. Finally, let's talk about the confessional booth. The confessional was where people admitted their sins in private to a priest in search of forgiveness. It was sacred. It was secret. And it was, occasionally, hilarious. Priests wrote manuals on what to ask. Have you committed impure thoughts with someone else's vegetables? Have you gambled during Lent? Have you sung songs with lewd metaphors? The answers varied. One man confessed to loving his neighbor's eldest daughter and her cat inappropriately. The priest paused, then prescribed a long prayer and an awkward silence. Another woman confessed to laughing during funerals. The priest prescribed candle holding and no jokes for 2 months. The confessional was where medieval people met mercy. It wasn't always gentle. It wasn't always fair. But it tried. The church court believed that sin could be healed, that souls could be cleaned, that a man who stole a pie and blamed it on Satan could, with enough fasting, become a better person, even if he never got the pie back. And so, the church's version of justice was less about punishment and more about penance. Less you are evil and more you are deeply flawed. But if you walk for 2 weeks and cry a bit, we'll let it slide. In the end, it was imperfect. Deeply. But it was also, in its own holy, fussy, over-scented way, merciful. The courtroom is full. The clerk is yawning. The judge is adjusting his hat. The bailiff is trying not to fall asleep. And somewhere in the corner, a man is preparing to argue that the chicken stole the bread, not him. Yes, welcome to the chaotic, clever, and occasionally ridiculous world of medieval legal tricks. We're not discussing crimes. We're discussing what came after the crime. Appeals, technicalities, brilliant defenses, hilariously bad ones. And the rare, glorious moment when someone stood before a court, shrugged, and said, "It wasn't me. It was the weather." This is the part of history where logic is stretched like old cheesecloth and loopholes are pulled tighter than a monk's belt. Let's watch medieval lawyers react with a raised eyebrow, an inkwell, and the phrase, well, technically. Let's start with appeals. In modern law, an appeal means you didn't like the decision and would like a second opinion from someone in a fancier robe. In the medieval world, appeals were trickier. If you wanted to appeal a decision, you had to travel, pay, know Latin, not be dead, a surprisingly common hurdle. Appealing to a higher court meant dealing with scribes, clerks, archdeacons, or even the king. The paperwork alone could kill a goat. One peasant in 1283 appealed his pig-stealing sentence all the way to the royal court. The court read the documents, laughed, and sent it back with a note. Let the village sort it out. The pig was eaten before the appeal arrived. Timing mattered. In some courts, you had to appeal within a certain number of days, often 3, which meant if you were in stocks for 3 days, your right to appeal expired the moment they let you out. Convenient. Now let's talk loopholes. Oh, the medieval world loved a loophole. The most famous involved something called benefit of clergy. If you could prove you were a cleric, or pretend convincingly, you could be tried in church court instead of secular court. Why was this good? Because the church court didn't do executions. Instead of being hanged, you might be fined, exiled, or asked to copy psalms until you repented. So how did people prove they were clergy? Easy. You read. Out loud. In Latin. Specifically, you read a verse from the Bible. If you managed it, you were considered a man of the cloth. This became so common that they started using the same verse over and over. Psalm 51, verse 1. It became known as the neck verse because it saved so many necks. Of course, people memorized it even if they couldn't read. You just had to sound confident. One man recited it while sweating profusely and looking at the ceiling. The judge paused, narrowed his eyes, and said, good enough. Neck saved. Now let's talk about technicalities. Some defendants escaped punishment because of improper procedure, faulty paperwork, misnamed witnesses, or a rooster crowing at the wrong time, which was considered a sign. In one famous trial, a man was accused of stealing 2 horses. The record mistakenly said 2 geese. He argued that since he'd never even seen the geese in question, he was clearly innocent. The court, realizing the mistake, dropped the charges. He rode home on the horses, allegedly. Another man was acquitted because the moon was full during his trial, and the local priest believed that justice should only be delivered during neutral moonlight. The court agreed. Trial postponed. Forever. And what about clever defenses? Oh, there were some gems. Let's explore a few. Case 1. I didn't steal it. I found it. A man was caught with stolen boots. He claimed he'd found them on his own doorstep. The court asked why he hadn't returned them. He said he was on his way to return them when someone screamed, "Thief," and confused everything. He was fined, lightly. The judge noted his creative intent. Case 2. The devil made me do it. Common, but risky. This defense was used in cases of sudden violence, repeated lying, excessive dancing. The courts didn't like blaming Satan without permission. But occasionally, if the accused wept convincingly and mentioned demons by name, they were given penance instead of execution. One man claimed a demon named Wilfred made him knock over the baptismal font. He was sentenced to recite prayers and never visit the font again. Wilfred was not summoned to testify. Case 3. It wasn't me, it was my twin. Oh yes, twins were rare and confusing. One court had 2 identical brothers accused of stealing bread. Neither confessed. No witnesses could tell them apart. The judge, utterly exasperated, ordered them both to apologize, share the punishment, and never appear in court at the same time again. They didn't, but their cousin showed up a week later with bread. Case 4. I was sleepwalking. One man, in a village near Dijon, claimed he had sleepwalked into a barn, taken a chicken, and eaten half of it before waking. He said it was a common condition, triggered by dreams about hunger and loud clucking. The judge, fascinated, asked several questions. The man offered to prove it by falling asleep in the courtroom. He was told to pay for the chicken and write a poem in its honor. He did. The poem survives. It's terrible. Now let's talk about witness manipulation. If you couldn't win the case fairly, you could. Bribe a witness. Threaten a witness. Replace a witness with your cousin. This was not encouraged, but it happened. One trial record notes that the same witness has testified in 4 pig-related cases this month and is beginning to smell curious. Courts began requiring witnesses to swear oaths, sometimes on bones, relics, or, in rare cases, the town's nicest goat. The goat was unbothered. And then there was jury tampering. In medieval England, jurors were often local villagers, which meant they knew the accused, owed them favors, hated their cousins, or all of the above. One man's jury acquitted him because he once helped repair the town mill during a flood. The judge sighed, wrote, "Acquitted due to generous spirit," and moved on. In another case, a man bribed the jurors with wine. It worked. Then one juror complained the wine tasted like vinegar. They retried the case. The man was convicted. Moral: always bribe with good wine. Now, let's visit the mercy loophole. Sometimes a defendant would throw themselves on the mercy of the court. Literally, they would kneel, weep, mention their many children, list their ailments. One man described 17 different injuries, including phantom thumb pain and internal coldness. The court gave him a reduced sentence and a hot meal. Another woman claimed her only income was from braiding horsetails. She was found guilty, but the court declared her creatively impoverished and ordered her to spend 3 days helping at the monastery kitchen. She left with 2 recipes and a husband. Occasionally, a judge would offer trial by combat. This was rare, and usually regretted immediately. One man, when given the choice, chose trial by combat against the man accusing him. They were both 70 years old. They fought with walking sticks. The combat ended in a mutual nap. The judge declared divine indifference and fined them both a cabbage. Lastly, let's talk about clever clerks. Because while the accused may have used tricks, so did the people writing the records. Some clerks inserted jokes. One wrote, "The defendant's eyebrows seemed guilty." Another added a doodle of a duck next to a particularly silly testimony. One clerk, fed up with contradictions in witness statements, simply wrote, "None of this makes sense, but I am required to write it, so here it is. We salute them." In the end, the medieval legal system was not just law. It was theater. People lied. People wept. People bribed with cheese, sang songs, blamed demons, and tried to convince everyone they were a bishop just because they owned a robe. And sometimes it worked. Was it fair? Rarely. Was it fascinating? Always. Because where there are laws, there are loopholes. And where there are loopholes, there are people absolutely determined to crawl through them with a smirk and a handful of suspiciously shiny turnips. You've seen the trials, heard the sentences, stood beside the poor, the accused, the clever, the wrongly blamed, the very confused. You've watched pigs go to court. You've floated in cold water. You've held a candle in church, hoping no one remembers what you said about Agnes last summer. And now, at last, the gavel is down. The crowd has gone home. And justice, strange, flawed, and sometimes just plain silly, has been served, cold, in a wooden bowl, with a side of medieval soup and exactly 1 spoon. You are, for now, law-abiding, occasionally, unless you've recently insulted a bishop's cow, in which case, good luck. And so, the bells have stopped ringing. The last page has been copied. The courtroom is quiet, except for one very confused chicken, who somehow made it through the entire trial process without being sentenced. You've heard the arguments. You've witnessed the crimes. You've survived the soup-throwing, pig-stealing, tavern-fighting, cabbage-shaming symphony of medieval justice. And through it all, somehow, justice was done, more or less, give or take, depending on the judge's mood and the goat-to-human ratio in the room. It wasn't always fair, It wasn't always kind, but it was never boring. Justice in the Middle Ages was part punishment, part performance, part neighborly squabble with legal consequences, all stitched together by scribes with ink-stained sleeves and very, very tired eyes. And while we've come a long way, with courts that now mostly avoid boiling cauldrons, part of that messy, clumsy, cabbage-flavored legacy remains. So the next time you hear a strange rustling in the pantry, or see your neighbor's cow looking at you suspiciously, remember, in another time, that could have ended in a public trial, a dramatic speech, and someone being lightly whipped for staring at vegetables. Sleep well, dear friend. The trials are over. The candles are out. And your pig is probably innocent. Goodbye, until next time.